If you're just joining us here in France 24, we're in the France 24 debate. We're looking at this all taking place on the day the UN General Assembly opens, and it opens with a summit on refugees. And we're talking about that summit on refugees with our panel from New York, Angela Merkel, political editor of the Internet Current Affairs website Heat Street. Welcome back as well to Jonathan Chaloff of the International Migration Division of the OECD, Shoshana Fine, research associate at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po, and from Brussels, Misha Mondrikamen of the Belgium's People's Party. Welcome back to all of you. We were talking, and I'll put it to you, Jonathan Chaloff, about perception. And this latest incident that we just saw in New York is for many going to fuel perception that, Muslim equals terrorist and immigrant equals terrorist and this kind of thing.
No, I think perception is an important question, because what you do see in general in migration is that the public perception of the volume of migration is much, much higher than the real levels. Now, migration is a fact of life. There's a substantial amount of migration into OECD countries, more than 4 million people a year. This is not asylum, but just people coming and going. And yet, if you ask people within OECD countries, they usually will give numbers that are triple, 4, 5, 10 times the number of migrants who are actually in their country. So there's an exaggerated perception. There's also an exaggerated perception of the negative effects, because if you look at the consensus, almost all economic studies show very, very small benefit. Now, these two, this perception that's exaggerated and a negative perception of the real impact of migration doesn't change the fact that there are this is not the same for everyone, that there are certain areas that are highly concentrated with migrants, that there are some migrants who have a very long time to integrate, so that refugees on average take 20 years to reach the same employment level as native peers. So there is a long integration period. It does happen, but it takes time and it takes effort. And then the distance between the actual facts and the perception is quite large. And this is something that politicians have been less successful at bridging.
But the unemployment rate, that's not a perception, that's a reality. And among working class people who see these refugees as a threat to their jobs.
I think that those are two separate questions. So yes, refugees take much longer than other migrants to integrate. Most migrants integrate very quickly into the labor market. In many countries, they have a higher rate of employment than natives. Refugees, obviously, because they come with nothing, they don't speak the language, they don't even have proof of their education. It takes much longer time for them to integrate into the labor force. Now, is that a threat to employment? All the evidence says no, in that the refugees aren't working in the same jobs. And there's not just one pie, that more people come, more people eat the pie grows. And you see that in Germany, actually. German economic growth the past year has been partly driven by the increase in demand in services created by this influx.
Angela Merkel, your country, the United States of America, based on waves of immigration that have helped the country grow. The U.S. president, the outgoing one, saying he's going to increase the quota of refugees coming in from 100 to 110,000. Again, we're talking about this number pales in comparison to how many refugees and displaced there are around the world, but nonetheless, an increase. But there is this sense that it could be the end of an era for the United States.
Yeah, I think, we're talking about this in the context of the bombing over the weekend. Part of what I think Americans are nervous about, and Europeans as well, is that there's a perception that our authorities are not being realistic about the potential security risks. So you've got our Mayor de Blasio here in New York City being very hesitant to call a bombing an act of terrorism. Then you've got in Germany, for instance, in Cologne, what happened. The government covering up, being very silent about some of the sexual violence that happened on New Year's. Now, do those things mean that we shouldn't take refugees? Absolutely not. But when there's a pro-refugee attitude that, I guess, minimizes or diminishes or ignores outright risks that are very real risks, I think that makes people a little bit more hesitant to accept refugees right now. And that's unfortunately what we're seeing. Now, I will point out that the United States has been much more cautious in its process of accepting refugees. We have a very extensive vetting process. That said, there are some problems with it. It is difficult when you're bringing in people from war-torn countries where documentation isn't always there, where there aren't always good databases to check. But the United States has at minimum done that. I think what we see in Europe, though, last year I was in Serbia, Hungary, Croatia, Austria. And what we really saw was an uncontrolled migration where people are crossing the border and we don't really have a confident sense of who they are. We've already seen Greece and Italy sometimes being so overwhelmed, 8,000, 9,000 people crossing a day that they can't do the basic things required under Dublin Agreement, such as fingerprinting.
All right, so after the experience of last year, what should they do? What advice would you give to these countries?
Well, I think, first of all, it needs to be something that's reached as an agreement. It was not helpful last year when Germany, for instance, announced that it was going to suspend the Dublin Agreement for Syrian refugees. That created a situation where other countries who weren't on board, sorry, my light switch is going out, where other countries who weren't on board with this were in a position where they had people crossing through, trying to get to Germany. So I think that unilateral action was not helpful. I think this is something that really needs cooperation. Unfortunately, it's showing a lot of the ways that the European Union is strained, and that's coming in the context of not just that challenge, but for instance, Ukraine, some of the financial things that have been happening. And this really does pose a significant security challenge, cultural challenge, economic challenge.
All right, let me ask you about this. Is it point taken, Shoshana Fine, that the EU seemed to be writing the script as it went along last summer?
I mean, writing the script as it went along, I mean, it's interesting to take a look back and think a little bit more about perception, as we were talking about earlier, and the migrant as a security threat. I think it's important to look at the evidence, which doesn't show in any kind of correlation between an increase in migration or refugees and an increase in delinquents or an increase in terrorism, for example. But what we can see over the past year, since the 1980s, but more and more in the 1990s and 2000s, is in the political and media discourse and in policies and practices a connection between migration and a security threat. And we can really talk about the securitization of migration in this respect. And this is something which very much we can see, for instance, in the resettlement practices to the US. And as the other speaker mentioned, the US has many vetting practices to make sure that refugees, that terrorists don't use the refugee channel to come to the US. Now, unfortunately, we need to think about some of the secondary effects of these practices in countries like Turkey, where these programs are in place. And what we can see with these databases, which are incredibly unreliable and rely on profiling schemes, is that many men, it's often single Muslim men who have names which are confused or come up in these databases, and then they're considered as potential risks, even where there's no real evidence for that, simply that their Arabic name has come up in a database, and then they were rejected from resettlement practices and left in this kind of legal loophole where they're stuck in Turkey, they can't move on, they then try to move through Europe through legal channels. So this whole resettlement process and the securitization of this process leaves these people in very difficult situations without respecting their fundamental rights.
All right, we have reactions on the hashtag F24 debate, including one from Aurélie. Many references to smugglers at the root causes of the roundtable at the UN for Refugees summit. Once again, states are confused between causes and symptoms. Do you agree when it comes to smugglers, we're all a bit confused?
I think we're all incredibly confused when it comes to smugglers. I think we're also using the terms trafficking and smuggling interchangeably. There's a difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. Smuggling is facilitating a migrant into another country, whereas trafficking involves forced labour. So I think we need to be very clear about a difference between smuggling and trafficking. I think we're often talking about unscrupulous smugglers, and it's true that in some cases smugglers are unscrupulous and they are abusing migrants. But often, from what we can see with these very low resettlement quotas, often it's only thanks to smugglers that prospective refugees can reach places like Europe where they can claim asylum. So I think it's really muddy waters here.
All right, a couple of questions. I'm going to start with one which I'll put to you, Jonathan Chaloff. 65 million people moving around the planet. It's a record. Of course, we're 7 billion now. People can move faster than they ever could before. Is is this really an opportunity, as some say?
Well, I mean, as I said before, migration is really a fact of life. And so that it's true that there are more people than ever before living in countries in which they weren't born. I think the figure is more like 120 million in the world living outside the country in which they were born. So it's a very large number of people. And as you say, the population is growing. And probably this will become an even larger number in the future because all of the factors that are driving migration are continuing. That said, it's not an unmanageable number. Remember that if you say that there, as I said, about 4.2, 4.8 million people a year come into OECD countries. That's not a very large. There are most OECD countries, it's 1 in 8 people is foreign born, and this number is slowly rising, but these are manageable figures. The question is, can countries find a way to anticipate the future crises and deal with them beforehand? Because I don't necessarily agree with what the other speakers have said, that this was the European framework was ready for this crisis. It clearly wasn't. No, that there's no guarantee under the current international framework that countries will cooperate. And there needs to be an international cooperation framework to deal with this crisis in the future.
So, Michel Monjukamen, what happens if you get your wish, if you shut the borders? What happens then?
First of all, if we close the borders, as we intend, we will protect better the citizen. I'm sorry to say that I believe that the various experts have just heard just a bit in denial of reality. Should I remind you that among the killers in the Bataclan in Paris, there were among the 9 people, 2 came as refugees in Europe. And we arrest every day more and more people.
Yeah, they were using fake passports.
Or presenting themselves as refugees and sent by ISIS, by the Islamic State, in order to commit murders and atrocities. So our main aim as Eurosceptic parties, populist parties as you would call them, is first to be the voice of the voiceless. Because I'm afraid to tell you that the consequences of this open border policy is felt first by ordinary people. When you are in a popular neighborhood and where you have more and more foreign people, refugees or migrants coming with different attitudes vis-à-vis women, vis-à-vis security, vis-à-vis property and other problems, you are on the first line in order to get the consequences of these policies that are decided at the EU level.
But you're tarring everybody with the same paintbrush here.
Sorry?
You're saying, you're generalizing there. You're saying they're all like that.
Listen, I'm not generalizing, but let me give you a figure. There was in the Figaro of yesterday, a study saying that over 30% of Muslim people in France believe that Sharia should prevail on the civil code and the national law of France.
I don't know where you found that study.
And this rise to 50% of the young generation under 25. So if you tell me that the national cohesion of our society is not put in danger by these migrants and their belief...
But that's just plain wrong. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. That's plain wrong. When you know that most people who are Muslim in France are lapsed Muslims themselves. So it's plain wrong to assert something like that.
It's not wrong, and it's corroborated by many other studies from the University of Berlin, for example, with even higher figures. And this is threatening the core of our societies, the cohesion of our societies. And ordinary people just feel it, just know it, just see it every day. And I'm very surprised that all these experts cannot realize it with all the studies and books and so on, cannot realize what's going on in the street.
Shoshana, fine. Let me ask you about this. Is there a discrepancy between the reality and the perception?
Absolutely, and I think this is really quite terrifying. I mean, how many times have we said the term Muslim during this debate? Many times. This didn't used to be an issue, but I think what we can see increasingly is a rising Islamophobia when we're talking about migration policy. This has always existed at some kind of level, but it's become increasingly explicit. So this kind of orientalization of migration policy, where not only are we securitizing the refugee, but particularly the Muslim refugee. And what is happening with this is that these these people, we're taking away their fundamental rights because we're putting them in a kind of collective, securitized identity as part of a kind of Muslim threat.
Julian Melchior, in your country, it's not just Muslims, it's also Mexicans that have come up in conversation. And of course, Mexicans, I get the impression it's sort of a loose term to mean people from Latin America.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly been a characteristic of this election cycle. I think what's really unfortunate, though, is that it's been dialogue that's coming from the right. Conservatives have typically believed in free markets. Part of that is believing in free labor, the labor market freed up. And because of that, being very pro-immigrant, I think it's been tragic to watch the Republican Party become so anti-immigrant. There are a lot of conservatives who don't believe that. Adding to that frustration, I think, though, is that we can no longer talk about immigration just across our border, just with our neighboring states. There is that added security component. And I think that's made people a lot less comfortable.
So is it the end of liberal values? Liberal values, I mean the liberal values born of the 18th century that have helped power capitalism.
We're certainly asking ourselves that. This election may change conservatism as we know it.
Jonathan Chaloff?
I have to say, I mean, following up on what Gillian said, that actually there are two important points about this populist reaction to migration. And actually, the OECD, if you look at our annual publication that came out today, we talk about how to fight against this backlash against migration. And there are two important points, actually, we heard them tonight. First, there's a perception of this elites, that the elites don't understand what's really happening. And the second is that there is a transformation going on in our societies. And as I said, you know, the effects of migration are very concentrated. And it's in neighborhoods, you know, so that it tends to be that people see this effect, and this can be, and the second is that there's a sense that the government, that policy is no longer able to take care of it, that the migration is out of control. And this is also a communication problem in that there is no plan to get out of it. And you have to recognize, I think, that it's important that policymakers recognize there are integration problems. It does take an investment, that there will be costs, that nothing will be simple, and that these costs are upfront right now, but that there is a payoff over time, both in terms of a more equal society and in terms of making sure that these individuals have a chance to use their skills and contribute to the countries they've gone to.
All right, I want to thank you, Jonathan Chaloff. I want to thank Gillian Melchior in New York, Misha Mondrikamen for being with us from Brussels, Shoshana Fine. Stay with us. Our Media Watch segment is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, François. Just looking initially at some reactions to Bill de Blasio's press conference, which you were just showing a couple of moments ago. Of course, lots of comment on social media about the fact that he is now calling the attacks in New York City an act of terrorism, which up until yesterday he was refusing to do. And so on social media, quite a lot of reactions about that. Will intentional attack become the new politically correct euphemism, quips one Twitter user?
Because so far, and this is early days, as I speak at 7:53 p.m. Paris time, they haven't been linked to any specific group yet.
That's right. So just the use of the term terrorism, I suppose, is what the innovation is here, or the change. Mayor de Blasio, a bit blasé about the whole thing, really, was one comment yesterday. And of course now his change in rhetoric, I suppose, we have every reason to believe this was an act of terror. Now, the reason I mention this is, of course, the impact that this could have on issues of migration, refugees, etc. And you can see here Ted Cruz calling for a refugee crackdown, as de Blasio admits that the New York and New Jersey bombings was an act of terror. So we might have been seeing lots of demonstrations in London and New York City and elsewhere to kind of raise awareness of the issue of the plight of refugees ahead of the UN General Assembly. You saw that there was a demonstration such as this with life jackets that were actually used by refugees, life jackets that were picked up in Greece and elsewhere, put on the shores of Brooklyn there, and also on front of Parliament in London, to raise awareness of the tragic human cost of failing to deal with this crisis. But unfortunately, with news as it currently is, even if you are having tweets with hashtags, for example, saying "Stand with Refugees," you are also, François, having a lot of reactions linking suspected terror attacks with the issue of refugees and migration, even though those two issues should, of course, be kept very much separate. They are being conflated.
Do you feel like the argument about refugees is being drowned out in this particular instance with this one incident in the New York area?
I mean, absolutely. It's really very unfortunate to once again be seeing a terrorist incident and associating this with refugees. Refugees have absolutely nothing to do with this incident. This is something we're seeing more and more, that we are amalgamating, pushing together the issue of refugees with terrorism, with delinquents, with different forms of security threat.
That's right, and you can see that very present on social media. You just tap in New York refugees and you get a whole range of comments on social networks linking the two, which, as we were saying, is unfortunate. And we have seen that in France as well, the debate about refugees being very much, I suppose, confused with security debates. 1 in 5 refugees, that's Syrian refugees, I believe, settled in, who have gone to the US, have been settled in the New York area. How is that working out? Obama wants more because 11 bombs in 24 hours isn't enough. Anyway, that's just to give you a flavour of some of the comments that you're seeing of that nature on social media. I would say drowning out some of the more sensitive and supportive remarks with hashtags such as Stand With Refugees.
All right, many thanks, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.